This is not a motorhome. What you are looking at is a modern apartment that someone dropped onto an expedition chassis. 6 wheels, 3 axles, and a cantilevered upper volume so severe it should not physically balance, but it does. That tension between architectural brutalism and actual engineering logic is exactly why this concept is worth dissecting. Here is how we are walking through it. First, the stance, the triple axle layout, and why it is not just for show. Then the box architecture, the rhythm of glass and matte paneling that turns this from vehicle into minimalist housing. After that, we step inside and reconstruct the interior layout using nothing but the proportions visible through these tinted panels, detective work, because the exterior always tells the truth about what is happening inside. Then the powertrain. If this were ever engineered for reality, what would actually move something this massive? And finally, the verdict. But I am saving one detail for the end. Look at the rear of this concept. See how the bodywork tapers inward? That is not a styling choice. It is a hidden structural necessity. I think it might be the most intelligent geometric decision on the entire build, and I will explain why when we get there. The face of this concept is doing something deliberately confrontational. There is no friendly curvature here. The windshield is steeply raked, almost faceted like a stealth aircraft, and it sits beneath a massive overhang that projects forward like the brow of a building. The hexagonal logo centered low on the nose reads less like a badge and more like a piece of architectural hardware, a door handle on a luxury villa. What this face communicates before the vehicle ever moves is dominance. It says, I am not asking for space on the road. I am occupying it, and yet, that aggression is controlled. The lighting is not shouty. It is thin, linear, tracing the lower edges of the body like a draftsman's final ink stroke. That restraint is what keeps this from looking like a prop and starts making it look like a proposal. Now move to the side, because this is where the concept stops being a drawing and starts becoming a structural argument. The silhouette is top-heavy by any conventional standard. You have what appears to be 3 full habitable levels stacked above a chassis, with the uppermost section cantilevering out over the cab. On a standard dual-axle motorhome, that much mass forward of the centerline would create a dangerous imbalance. The front axle would be light under braking. The rear would be overloaded. It would handle like a shopping cart with a bowling ball strapped to the front. The third axle changes everything. By placing that rear tandem axle cluster roughly beneath the midpoint of the habitable volume, the designer has created a counterweight system. The sleeping loft, and I am almost certain that is what sits in that forward cantilever, is balanced by the drivetrain, battery mass, and rear structure sitting aft of the centerline. The third axle is not there to look tough. It is there to make the architecture possible. That is expert logic. But here is the friend translation. This thing does not rock when you walk to the front. It stays planted. You do not feel seasick making coffee. The proportions reinforce this. The wheelbase is long. Visually, probably pushing 20 feet between the first and third axle centers. That stretches the silhouette low to the ground despite the height. The glass-to-body ratio is extreme. You're looking at maybe 60% glazed surface on the habitable sections, which would be a thermal nightmare in a real build, but visually it dissolves the mess. The vehicle becomes a glass box wearing a white frame. A box this tall and flat should look like a brick in a wind tunnel. But it does not, and the reason is in the faceting. Look at the cab overhang, the underside of that forward cantilever. Instead of a flat slab, the designer has cut angular shadow lines into the belly. These facets do 2 things. Visually, they break up the volume so your eye reads layers instead of bulk. Functionally, if this were ever engineered for reality, those facets would act as air management surfaces, kicking airflow downward and reducing the low-pressure zone that typically drags behind a tall, blunt face at highway speed. They soften the massive upper volume without softening the design language. Down the flanks, the same logic repeats. The body panels do not curve. they fold. Each crease creates a shadow line that changes as the light moves across it. In a static showroom, that gives the surface life. On a road in motion, it would make the concept appear to shift shape as the sun crossed it. That is not automotive styling. That is architectural lighting strategy applied to a moving object. The finish is matte white or very light silver, non-reflective, almost chalky. Against the black tinted glass, the contrast is absolute. There is no gradient, no fade, no metallic flake catching the light. It is the same material logic you see in high-end minimalist housing. Let the form do the work, not the paint. The wheels sit inside hexagonal arches that read as armored housing. The tires protrude slightly beyond the body line, giving a wide-body stance that grounds the silhouette. I keep coming back to the phrase grounded aggression, because that is exactly what this achieves. The upper half wants to float. The lower half refuses to let it. That tension is the entire aesthetic. But the exterior is only half the argument. Because with this much glass, the interior is already on display. We can see chandeliers through those windows. We can see greenery. We can see levels. And that means we can reconstruct what it would actually feel like to live inside, starting with how tall these ceilings really are. We do not have interior renders, but we have something almost as useful: proportional honesty. The exterior panels do not lie about volume. So let us read them. Take the front wheel as your scale reference. That tire looks to be roughly 40 inches in diameter, somewhere in the 365-70 range if we are using commercial truck metrics. That gives us a scale bar. Each visible habitable level appears to be roughly 1.5 wheel diameters in internal height. Translation: ceiling heights in the 9 to 10 foot range per floor. You are not ducking in this concept. You are standing upright with room above your head for a chandelier, which, judging by the glow through the glass, is exactly what the designer installed. Working front to back, the habitable length divides into distinct territories. The cockpit sits beneath that steep windshield. Given the angle of the glass, driver visibility would be panoramic, almost vulnerable in its openness. You would see the road as a horizon line, not a viewport. In a near-future build scenario, that extreme glazing makes the most sense if paired with a digital instrument cluster and some level of autonomous highway capability, because the physical dash space is clearly minimal. Behind the cockpit, the ground floor opens into what I read as the primary living zone. The glass panels here are floor to ceiling, and the furniture visible through them is low-profile, modular, arranged for conversation rather than transit. This is not a cabin. It is a lounge that happens to be mobile. Imagine waking up in a space where the wall is entirely glass, and the view outside is not framed like a picture but present like weather. That is the sensation this level sells. The mid-level appears to be kitchen and dining. We can see pendant lighting and what looks like a long counter running parallel to the vehicle's axis. In a real build, induction would be the only logical choice. No open flame in a structure this tightly sealed, and the electrical infrastructure would already be robust. Surface area is clearly generous. Storage philosophy here would need to be magnetic or latch-based, because every drawer would need to secure itself against lateral forces during transit. The top level, cantilevered over the cab, is almost certainly the sleeping quarters. Positioned forward of the rear axle cluster, it would experience the least road noise and vibration. Privacy from the living zone below is built in by sheer vertical separation, 3 levels between you and the main lounge. Bed orientation is likely transverse, running wall to wall, because the width of the cantilever looks to support it. View access would be through the forward glass, meaning you wake up looking at where you are going, not where you have been. That is a small psychological detail, but it matters. It orients the occupant toward future space rather than past road. Bathroom placement is the hardest call. My guess is it sits aft of the sleeping level over the rear axle cluster, where the floor structure is stiffest and plumbing runs can be shortest. But here is the engineering reality. Water is heavy. A full gray water tank and fresh supply on a vehicle this tall would raise the center of gravity significantly. In a real-world build scenario, the water management would need to be active. Pump-driven transfer between tanks to maintain balance as supplies deplete, almost like ballast in a ship. Walk-in shower feasibility? At these ceiling heights, absolutely. But the drain location would need to accommodate vehicle tilt when parked on uneven ground. Climate control in a glass box this size is not a thermostat problem. It is a thermal management problem. The concept would need zoned HVAC, probably tied to predictive routing, pre-cooling the sleeping quarters before arrival at a hot destination, for instance. Connectivity and solar charging management would integrate through a central hub, and given the rooftop terrace visible at the very top, there is almost certainly photovoltaic surface up there. Not enough to drive the vehicle, but enough to sustain interior systems off-grid for extended periods. End of section, forward hook. Which brings us to the question of how something this massive actually moves. Because brute force is not a powertrain strategy. It is an admission of failure. If this were ever engineered for reality, the propulsion would need to be smarter than the scale suggests. Full electric is the only logical path at this positioning level. A combustion engine of sufficient displacement to move what must be 30,000+ pounds would require cooling infrastructure that this body simply does not accommodate. Look at the front end, there is no grill volume. The nose is sealed. That is electric architecture. Battery capacity would need to be substantial. For context, a Tesla Semi runs roughly 900 kilowatt-hours in its largest configuration. If this concept were ever engineered for reality, something in that range, 800 to 1,000 kilowatt-hours, would be the starting point, distributed across the chassis between the axle clusters to keep the center of gravity as low as possible. Range would likely be modest, perhaps 300 miles at highway speeds, because the frontal area is enormous. But this is not a vehicle designed for efficiency. It is designed for presence. The solar roof logic we touched on earlier bears repeating. The top terrace appears to have planted surfaces and open decking, but the perimeter structure is almost certainly glass or panel ready. In a real-world build scenario, that surface would not power the drivetrain. It would power the life inside. Climate systems, lighting, connectivity, refrigeration, sustained indefinitely without shore power. That is the off-grid luxury promise. Triple axle configuration opens up drivetrain possibilities. Dual-motor rear axle with torque vectoring would give this concept traction on loose surfaces that its size suggests it should never attempt. The front axle could carry a third motor for all-wheel capability. Obviously, this is still conceptual territory, but the geometry supports it. The wheel arches are large enough to accommodate significant suspension travel, and the tires look to be all-terrain rated. Smart systems would need to include predictive route planning, not just for charging stops, but for height restrictions. A vehicle this tall would be banned from most parking structures and many urban corridors. Autonomous highway mode makes even more sense here than in passenger cars, because the mass and momentum would benefit from algorithmic smoothness. No human driver brakes as gently as a computer, anticipating a stop 2 miles ahead. Let us get specific. What this concept does genuinely well is structural honesty. It does not pretend to be a sports car. It does not apologize for its mass. The triple axle layout directly solves a problem that the architecture created, and that kind of cause and effect thinking is rarer in concept design than it should be. The designer asked, "How do I build a 3-level glass apartment on wheels?" And answered, "By adding the axle that makes it physically possible." That is credible design reasoning. What seems impractical is the height. At an estimated 14 to 16 feet overall, this concept would be illegal on many U.S. interstate routes without an oversized permit. Bridge clearances in the eastern United States average 13.5 feet. You would be route restricted constantly. In the UK, it would be nearly unusable on rural A roads. The width appears to push the legal limit as well. This is a vehicle that demands infrastructure rather than adapting to it. That is a problem if the premise is freedom. The most impressive detail, the one I would point to in a design school critique, is that tapered rear departure angle we teased in the opening. Here is the reveal. A vehicle this long, with 3 axles and a rear overhang, would destroy its own bodywork on any driveway slope, any curb, any uneven campsite entry, unless the rear geometry was specifically truncated. That taper is not styling. It is clearance geometry. It allows the rear to lift and rotate without contact. The engineering to make this real does not fully exist yet, but the logic is already correct. I genuinely have not seen that level of functional thinking in a concept motorhome before. One thing I would change: active ride height. If this concept is going to claim any off-road or even off-pavement credibility, it needs the ability to lower itself for highway stability and raise itself for clearance. Fixed suspension at this scale is a liability. Air suspension or hydraulic leveling would transform this from a static sculpture into a usable proposition. What it signals about luxury mobility is a shift from vehicle as product to vehicle as territory. This is not transportation. It is a mobile claim on space. Self-sufficient, self-contained, architecturally assertive. The question it leaves me with is whether luxury travel in the near future wants to blend in or announce itself. This concept chooses announcement. So here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. This concept gains stability and balance from that third axle, but it loses efficiency and maneuverability. If you were engineering this for real, would you keep the triple axle layout for the stability it provides, or drop to 2 axles with active load management to save weight and gain range? Solar roof or larger battery? Which would you prioritize for off-grid living? I am genuinely curious where you land, because I think the split will be 50-50. If this kind of analysis, reading a concept like a detective, not a cheerleader, is what you come to YouTube for, subscribing is the most efficient way to not miss the next one. We do this every week.